Wicked for Good, based on Act 2 of the musical Wicked, joins a long line of works that preach postmodernism, the idea that there is no such thing as an objective framework for explaining reality, that objective truth and objective meaning are simply man-made constructs. Here, there is only subjective meaning, where the rules are made up by the self. We see this implied when Elphaba says, "Good can't just be a word, it has to mean something." In this, the film frames good as something to be made meaningful, not meaningful in and of itself, which comes from the postmodern idea that there is no such thing as truth with a capital T, only lowercase t, commonly called personal truth, which refers to personal interpretation. One primary way the film promotes this is by blurring the line between actual truth and disinformation from propaganda. Another example promoting this idea is found in a key line that's repeated later partially. "It's not a lie, I'm just seeing things a different way." This theme is also underscored by the song Wonderful. The Wizard of Oz sings that truth and history are simply relative and ultimately not knowable. And, as revisionist works often do, the series also casts doubt on the ontology of goodness itself, with the first film opening with a caricature of goodness, with villagers using maxims like good conquers evil, while unknowingly slandering someone without understanding her true motives. The second film builds on this, with lines like, "Was I really seeking good, or just seeking attention? Is that all good deeds are, when looked at with an ice-cold eye? If that's all good deeds are, maybe that's the reason why." No good deed goes unpunished. So even though the sequel ends with two friends saying they've been changed for the better, the word better rings quite hollow when you've done away with the categories of good and bad. So the word better no longer holds any objective meaning. This is shown well in the film, which pushes the message that truth is something unknowable. But of course, even the claim that truth is not knowable is a claim about knowing something true. And this becomes painfully glaring when the film describes something as a lie. How can someone discern truth from lies when truth is not knowable? But the film wants to have it both ways, to have truth be knowable and unknowable at the same time. And the contradictions don't stop here. There's a more fundamental dilemma for the postmodernist mentality. Keep in mind, the postmodernist does not believe that there is such a thing as an overarching narrative that can explain reality, something scholars call a meta-narrative, a universal, overarching, and all-encompassing story by which to make value judgments about whether something is true, false, good, or bad. But even this principle, that meta-narratives do not exist, is itself a meta-narrative. See, the very notion that there is no overarching framework for reality is meant to be an overarching framework for reality. In other words, postmodernism's rejection of value judgment is itself a value judgment. Here we see the true aim of postmodernism, that it's not to privilege personal truth, but to privilege some personal truths over others. But there's more incoherence. See, a central theme in Wicked Part 1 and Part 2 is that the name Wicked is a misnomer for Elphaba, that she is actually very outstanding in many ways. Most audience members will have no problem with this, since common moral intuitions go along with this, saying that there are absolute good and absolute bad, such as the idea that compassion for those in need is absolutely good, or that malicious deception is absolutely wrong. And while I'm glad that the series frames these as absolutes, it's painful to see them not recognize that they're undermining their own worldview, because postmodernism actually doesn't give us the option to frame anything as absolute. And of course, this problem is not unique to this series. The postmodern problem of wanting to show the hero as heroic or sympathetic goes against a worldview that rejects putting parameters or drawing lines to designate or define anything. Ultimately, postmodernism seals its own fate by forbidding anything specific, which itself is a specification. And if there are no such things that are clearly good or clearly evil, if every truth claim is just an opinion, what's wrong with sexual assault, or cruelty, or forced labor? bullying, or ostracization, as long as the individual feels that these are correct or authentic actions for them. I mean, sure, infidelity is never convenient, especially for the children affected by it, but both Part 1 and Part 2 lack a moral category to condemn it. And on that note, what's wrong with unwarranted prejudice? Playing favorites with your children? Does postmodernism have logical grounds to either moral outrage or moral approval? To promote certain sexualities as morally neutral? Or to say that sorcery can ever be morally justified? Logic would say no, and say that it's all arbitrary for this framework. Saying that the truth is not a thing of fact or reason is an attempt to make a factual statement or appeal to reason. And claiming that there are such things as moral ambiguities is not a very ambiguous position. Just like calling something gray is actually not very gray. It's a specific black and white statement. Because all of these claims rely on some measure of certainty. But did you know that the heart of postmodernism is just a repackaged version of an older lie? The older name it went by was solipsism, a word that shares its origin with the word solo, meaning self. Postmodernism, or more accurately, solipsism, is dangerous because it makes the self the ultimate authority over truth. Here, no other source of knowledge can ever interrogate someone's personal interpretation, as your own lived experience is trustworthy enough. No one else has the right to tell you what is right or wrong, nor can they correct you. This is why, in postmodernism, the misunderstood self is always the ultimate hero, and the villain, the evil establishment that tells people to conform. Postmodernism always gives the hero many noble traits to push the message that individual interpretation is the ultimate value, although the assumption was supposed to be that there are no universal values. In postmodernity, it is no longer our intuitions that must conform to reality, but reality itself that must bow to our intuitions. Infallibility is no longer a trait ascribed to God or cosmic authority, but to the self and self alone. And this lie that you are the author of truth traps people with pride, and they fall for the same lie as Adam and Eve did. The lie that says we can reinvent our own rules and we can even usurp God's place. And one of the most damaging parts is that the series treats witchcraft almost as a means of spiritual deliverance, even appropriating Christian imagery, giving the witch the messianic role, the friend to the outcasts and liberator of the captives, who animates the legs of the lame and takes upon herself the sin of another, to her own demise and even resurrection. When the ultimate authority is the self, you cannot trust the scientific method, empirical findings, or the most qualified doctor's diagnosis when they do not affirm or align with your personal truth. Like someone with anorexia trusts her own interpretation over medical facts to conclude that she is overweight, a postmodernist too stares into a mirror and turns his personal interpretation into an idol, a counterfeit god. Whereas modernism holds out the lure of the sovereignty of the self, postmodernism goes a step further, turning the self into a permanent victim. Or, as Dr. Rosaria Butterfield states,
in modernity, the idea was it was the self-autonomous individual finding meaning in nothing but himself.
That's the American creed.
But now we're at even a more dangerous place because we've moved from modernity to post-modernity. And we are now in a place where we have the quote-unquote intersectional person finding purpose and meaning in nothing but victimhood.
Yeah, that's so true.
And you know, that is damaging in a different way.
C.S. Lewis, in his book Paralandra, powerfully describes this kind of narrative that traps people, especially women, with the idea that the most empowering identity is that of an oppressed minority. At last, it dawned upon Ransom what all these stories were about. Each one of these women had stood forth alone and braved a terrible risk for her child, her lover, or her people. Each had been misunderstood, reviled, and persecuted. but each also magnificently vindicated by the event. Ransom had more than a suspicion that many of these noble pioneers had been what in ordinary terrestrial speech we call witches or perverts. What emerged from the stories was rather an image than an idea. The picture of the tall, slender form, unbowed though the world's weight rested on its shoulders, stepping forth fearless and friendless into the dark to do for others what those others forbade it to do, yet needed to have done. Lewis gets it. It's no accident that very often postmodern stories try to dignify the unconventional and unnatural in order to twist morality, by giving serial killers predispositions as excuses, by giving witches a traumatic background, by giving derelict rulers a supposedly higher calling. The resultant message? It's okay to murder if you suffered enough. It's okay to turn to the occult if you had enough tragedies. It's okay to abandon your kingdom if you're quote-unquote being true to yourself. The postmodern intersectional person is a departure from the classical anthropology of men and women being image bearers of a God who loves them, having made them as the crowning jewel of creation, and declaring the universe very good after their creation. And in abandoning this glorious calling for a tawdry artificial identity, postmodernism exchanges the eternal and true for the false and miserable. So this deception is never a purely intellectual problem. Its pernicious blindness is always spiritual at the core. Postmodernism is a distortion of true religion. King Jesus indeed is the hero of the universe, entitled to overthrow anybody who tries to compete against him. But unlike we, he is the truly innocent sufferer, and despite being God, he didn't consider his equality with God as something to be grasped, but put aside his privileges in order to lay down his life for all those who would trust in him alone for the forgiveness of sins. Unlike our earthly fathers and father figures, Christ was perfect in his love. Like Elphaba, he was misunderstood and rejected, despite having the best of intentions. But he did not deny reality by saying that truth is unknowable or that truth was just a construct. No, he told us the antidote for our confusion, revealing himself as the way, the truth, and the life, saying that no one comes to the Father except through him. He loved people enough to tell them the truth, not comforting lies. Solipsism lies to us, saying that we need to settle, that if we're flying solo, at least we're flying free, and that self-definition is the ultimate freedom. But if there is an objective standard for truth and significance, we don't have to construct our own meaning, faking it till we make it. May we humbly receive the meaning of life incarnate, Jesus Christ, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the truly wonderful Counselor, and capital T truth.